Reading 1, The Unwelcoming Earth. In December of 2015, 196 nations of planet Earth agreed to do their best to keep global warming to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial baselines. This was the 21st annual session of the Conference of the Parties, also known as COP21. The agreement reached has become known as the Paris Agreement. What's more, these nations agreed to also pursue efforts to limit temperature rise to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, sounds good, right? The problem is that global temperatures have already risen to more than 3/4 that amount. And by that, I mean 1.2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels by some estimates. What's more, and worse, the nations involved have only promised to reduce emissions, as the Paris Agreement has no enforcement mechanism. By the way, in the past few years, I've had to annually increase that number during my lectures. So when the Paris Agreement was signed, and that's back in 2015, global temperature rise was less than 1%, only 0.87 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. At that time, it was speculated that we would hit 1.5 degrees Celsius in 25 years, so that would be by the year 2040. However, in just 8 years since COP21 was signed, we hit 1 degree, then 1.1 degree, and now 1.2 degrees Celsius. Current estimates that we will not hit 1.5 degree until 2040, but by the end of this decade, the 2030s. Consequently, what is unfolding, unfortunately, is the absolute worst-case scenario. In 2015, we had hoped that global emissions would be significantly declining by 2023. They're not. They're not even declining by a little. Indeed, they've not even leveled off. To the contrary, global emissions have only increased since 2015. Moreover, they have significantly increased since 2015. In 2015, total greenhouse gas emissions from human activities was 47 million metric tons, 47 gigatons. In 2020, it was 58 gigatons. And that's an increase of 20% in 8 years. So allow me to repeat that. In the 7 years since the nations of planet Earth vowed to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, those emissions have not gone down, but rather have gone up by more than 20%. In less than 2 years after COP21, the IPCC, and that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change appointed by the United Nations to study the climate crisis, increased a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, outlining what would happen if we did not significantly cut greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, as the IPCC made clear, even a 1.5 degree rise would have profound global consequences. And a 2 degree rise would obviously be still worse. But what sort of consequences would we be facing if we failed to stop global temperatures at 2 degrees, which now seems entirely possible, if not likely? This is the question taken up by David Wallace Wells in a 2017 New York Magazine article entitled The Uninhabitable Earth. He subsequently wrote a book by the same name. So the uninhabitable Earth lays out the consequences of climate change if we do not act quickly and decisively. Wallace Wells explains, this article, and I'm quoting him, this article is the result of dozens of interviews and exchanges with climatologists and researchers in related fields, and reflects hundreds of scientific papers on the subject of climate change. What follows is not a series of predictions of what will happen. That will be determined in large measure by the much less certain science of human response. Instead, it is a portrait of our best understanding of where the planet is heading, absent of aggressive action. It's unlikely that all of these warning scenarios will be fully realized, largely because the devastation along the way will shake our complacency. He's hoping here. But those scenarios, and not the present climate, are the baseline. In fact, those are our schedule. So while Many authors focus on the impact of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise. Wallace Wells rightly notes that such a small rise in temperature is a best case, and at this point, entirely unlikely scenario, especially as human activity has already warmed the Earth by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, with this in mind, Wallace Wells takes up the question of what the Earth and our lives would look like with a 2.4 degrees Celsius rise, which is where we are headed if we do not act quickly. So this article and the book, The Uninhabitable Earth, generated quite a bit of controversy, as many people, including some climate scientists, thought that he was being too alarmist here. However, as Wallace Wells himself makes clear, this is just a scenario. So let me give you another quote from him. He notes that it is unlikely that this will all happen, as humanity will at some point hopefully wake up and act. But this is his point here. However, if we do not, Wallace Wells paints a picture of where, quote, business as normal will take us. And quite a bit has happened since The Uninhabitable Earth was published in 2017. In October of 2020, Wallace Wells published his most recent follow-up piece. He's made a number of follow-ups, which is entitled Beyond Catastrophe, A New Reality is Coming into View. And that's what we're going to be reading for this class. The good news is that the worst-case scenario of a 4 degrees Celsius rise now seems unlikely. So what's the reason for that? Well, it's principally because the cost of wind and solar energy has been plummeting in the last decade. The price of solar energy decreased almost tenfold from 2010 and the year 2020, although the trend has leveled off a little recently since 2020. But let me just repeat that. Solar panels now cost nearly 10 times, it did cost nearly 10 times more in 2010 than they did in 2020. During the same 10-year period, the cost of onshore wind also decreased by a big amount, for 70%. Consequently, as Wallace Wells makes clear, the world is now shifting away from coal power, which provided the cheapest source of electricity for more than a century. And it goes without saying that wind and solar are now far less expensive than gas-fired power plants, which have always been more expensive than coal. And, in case you're curious, by some estimates, nuclear power is now 5 to 6 times more expensive than wind. Although people still debate whether we should shut down our existing fission nuclear power plants, it makes little economic sense to ever build new ones. But let me be clear here in noting that the countries of the world didn't decide to switch to wind and solar because it was the right thing to do for the future of our species and the planet. Instead, it was really a market decision. They're simply the cheapest option right now. This is, of course, good news, as the future seems a little rosier than it did 5 years ago when Wallace Wells wrote that first article. However, it's by no means a rosy picture. Excuse me, impacts of the climate crisis were obviously already here during the 20-teens. So at the close of the 20-teens, journalists Sarah Rusman-Gross and Linda O'Connell published an article on the 7 numbers that show how dire the climate change has gotten in the decade of the teens. So let me enumerate those, and this is from their article. 1, the past 5 years were the hottest ever recorded on the planet. Subsequently, they've gotten hotter, by the way. 2, 4 of the 5 largest wildfires in California history happened during that decade. In fact, more of them have happened now. 6 Category 5 hurricanes tore through the Atlantic region in the past 4 years. 4, Arctic ice flows dropped about 13% during that decade. Floods with a 0.1% chance of happening, that's 1 in 1,000-year chance of happening in any given year, became a frequent occurrence. And there were more than $100 billion climate disasters, double from the decade before. In the past 2 years, since that article has written has only gotten worse. So I very much want to hear your thoughts about beyond catastrophe, a new climate reality is coming into view. And that's, again, the October 2022 article by David Wallace Wells. So what follows is a discussion that students and I had regarding the previous article by Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth. As with all of our discussions this term, it starts with students posting their thoughts to YouTube. I then respond to those thoughts. So most of these comments are as relevant now as they were when they were written a year or two ago. And in some cases, I think these comments are even more relevant today. However, I'm curious to see just what you see as the difference between your comments and the ones that I'm about to make here. So what follows now is the class discussion. This will be the normal way of doing it in this class. When I quote people, they've not been altered or paraphrased in any way. Sometimes I'll correct like a little typo or something. And because of space concerns, often I'm only going to read part of a comment, along with my reply here. And how it will work is I will first quote an observation by a student, followed by my thoughts. So, first comment by a student. After doing the reading, I felt more worried and scared rather than wanting to jump up and take action. Although his article said nothing but the truth, it left me feeling more discouraged than anything. As explained in the article, the actions that need to be taken are now more drastic because the action should have been made years ago. So I'm now commenting on this. But instead, the health of our world and the atmosphere was put on the back burner. One of the difficulties in opening people's eyes to the climate crisis is that they might feel, as this person very succinctly notes, scared rather than wanting to jump up to take action. However, just to be very clear about this class, just the first 3 weeks of Climate Crisis 101 are taken up with the problem. The next 7 weeks offer solutions. As we shall see, there's plenty that can be done to resolve this issue if we act decisively and act quickly. I hope that this material, because it does focus on solutions, will make you want to jump up to take action, in this person's words. In all honesty, this is next person, I thought this article would be like every other article addressing climate change that I had read before. I know the Earth is warming up. I know the rate at which it's warming is accelerating, and I know that if action isn't taken now, the future of this planet and its inhabitants won't look too bright. I thought that this article would just be redundant, consequently, embellishments of these points. What I came to realize after getting only 2.5 paragraphs deep into The Uninhabitable Earth was how incredibly pretentious my attitude toward the subject had been. There was so much more to learn. So, my comment. Make no mistake, anthropogenic climate change is not simple. Even if you're understanding the underlying science, which would be quite an accomplishment in its own right, there is so much more to address. As David Wallace Wells makes clear, the societal implications of all this are complex and profound. Excuse me, as are the remedies that we need to enact to mitigate the climate crisis. Climate Crisis 101, as the name suggests, is an introduction to the problem. However, as this person rightly notes, there's so much more to learn. Consequently, maybe the best way is to think of Climate Crisis 101 as an introduction to something that you may want to learn more about, either through coursework or just by keeping up with what's actually happening in our rapidly changing world. So next comment. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. I've come to understand that my mother's and grandparents' generation set my generation up for failure due to not taking into consideration their anthropogenic, that's human-caused, impact, climate impact. It is in the hands of my generation to save planet Earth. So Wallace's alarmist tone made me fear for the future of my kids that I wish to have one day. However, it filled me with fear that motivated me to do something about it. Take, for instance, ads and signs you see in regards to smoking tobacco. They definitely use an alarmist tone to encourage people to stop consuming them. Perhaps setting up warning signs on gas pumps and flight tickets, such as those seen in cigarette packs, would motivate my generation and others to make a change for our Earth. That's a great thought. As we shall see in detail, and this is my comment, there's a whole chapter of Climate Crisis 101, by the way, devoted to this topic. My generation, the older generations, did indeed set up the current generation coming on the scene, out of my students, you, for failure. Consequently, it is, to quote this person, in the hands of your generation to save the planet. As we shall see, there is nothing fair about this. My generation and those that came immediately after, which largely caused the problem, did very too little to solve it. In fact, many people, as we shall see, fiercely denied that there's even a problem. This is a great example of something that we could do to help the climate crisis. Put warning signs on gas pumps and air travel flight tickets, such as those on cigarette packs. It's a little idea, but it's a great one. Although health warnings are required on every package of cigarettes sold in the United States, in other countries, and I'm thinking of Germany here, the warnings are especially blunt and powerful, such as, this is a warning label from a German cigarette pack, smoking can cause a slow and painful death. What if we had similarly powerful warnings on gas pumps with the key terms used by David Wallace Wells? In other words, quote, burning fossil fuels is making the earth uninhabitable for human beings. As we shall repeatedly see in Climate Crisis 101, this class, there are all sorts of little things that we can do to help mitigate the climate crisis. Some of them, like this suggestion for warning labels, would be, really surprisingly easy to do. I also suspect that they would be surprisingly effective. This, little example makes clear that there are things that anyone can do to help with the climate crisis, such as by creating a viral online campaign designed to pressure politicians to require such warnings. By the way, if it were up to me, I would go further by drawing attention to the fact that over 50 million people are annually killed or injured worldwide by automobiles, and that, for the average American, automobile use is responsible for just about a quarter of their carbon footprint. So imagine if every shiny new car coming out of the showroom had a prominent warning sign actually painted across both sides of the car. Cars kill people and the planet. I'm just saying, it's an idea. Okay, next comment. Rather than give a simple breakdown of the statistics, David Wallace Wells challenges his readers to drop the past and present and instead project their thoughts into the future. Well said. He makes us realize that many parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, have next to no hope of surviving our current crisis, the climate crisis. In addition, Wallace Wells firmly grounds his readers in the hard reality that we face. The world is on track to surpass the goals set by the Paris Agreement. Yeah, so this comment is really succinct and to the point. The world is indeed on track to surpass the goals set by the Paris Agreement, and parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, and we'll be looking at Bangladesh in particular in this class, have next to no hope of surviving our current rate of climate change. A good deal of Bangladesh is going to be underwater a good bit of time. That's the reason. So the Paris Agreement, which was again signed in 2015, COP21, is a promise by nearly the 200 nations on Earth that they would take up the challenge of mitigating the climate crisis. Since it took decades to extract that promise, it was really quite an accomplishment. Fortunately, since then, little or nothing has been done. Why? Because this is just a promise. There's absolutely no way to enforce it. Simply put, the Paris Agreement has no teeth. As a consequence, we are well on our way to surpassing the goals set in Paris. One way or another, this will impact every country and every being, including the human ones on Earth. However, as this comment rightly notes, some countries and some people will be more impacted than others, with Bangladesh being a prime example. we refer to this as a climate justice issue because it is simply unjust that certain people in certain countries will suffer more than others. In this case, especially so, as Bangladesh did little to contribute to the climate crisis, which was overwhelmingly caused by the wealthy countries, on the planet. So, next comment. If every high school student were to read Wallace Wells's work, I believe that the world would see rapid change. If you ask the average person on the street what we need to do to mitigate the climate crisis, I suspect that many of them would say, we need more and better, wind turbines, solar arrays, electric cars. However, we also need more and better education, which, as far as I am concerned, should begin in elementary school, and not only in the United States, as 40% of people on the planet have never heard of a climate crisis. So that's my comment. So I'm commenting here. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done, as fossil fuel affiliates are staging an extraordinary campaign of disinformation to confuse the public. Still, we need to do all that we can to counter this and to make the people of the earth aware of the very horrific consequences of our actions. Education is just central here. So next comment. I found it strikingly interesting about the effect of climate change that we have on our oceans. I always knew that our oceans are being polluted and that marine life is being threatened. However, learning about the concept of ocean acidification really changed my perspective on the harmful effects of greenhouse gases. Many people are aware of the visible impact that we're having on the oceans, and this is my comment, such as by polluting them with all sorts of plastics. However, when it comes to dumping CO2 into our atmosphere, because we cannot, one, see the impact it has on ocean temperatures, and two, see how it increases the acidity of our planet's oceans, many people are completely unaware of these consequences of our actions. Unfortunately, other than studying the oceans for these changes, i.e. through temperature, measuring temperature changes and checking pH levels, we generally only become aware of them when we see their impact, such as through the wholesale death of our planet's coral reefs, which are now dying across the planet. This brings us back to the previous point, as we need to educate people about the horrific consequences of our actions. Depending on the car that you drive, for example, for every mile that you drive, you could be releasing as much as a pound of CO2 into the atmosphere. Not only will this contribute to the warming of the atmosphere and consequently, hence the warming of the oceans, as they're in immediate contact with somewhere around 75% of the Earth's surface. But in addition, most of this CO2 will be absorbed directly into the oceans. So out of your car, into the air, into the oceans, thereby increasing the acidity of the oceans and making our oceans uninhabitable for quite a bit of life. Regarding, so this is the next, Regarding a previous point, perhaps we could come up with a whole series of warnings to paint across new cars. Another option would be cars are killing our oceans. Just an idea. Next comment. It's a daunting reality that so much has happened over the past decade alone. It makes me wonder if stopping or slowing down climate change is even something that is possible, or if it is part of the Earth's evolution. So, my response. Prior to the last decade or so, people used to routinely ask me when the climate crisis was going to begin. This is now obviously a nonsensical question. It's already begun. As this comment rightly notes, so much has happened over the past decade alone, and it really has over the teens. Extreme weather events such as more common and more powerful hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, all that. It's important to note that weather and climate are different here, just so there's no confusion. Weather refers to short-term atmospheric conditions, where climate, on the other hand, is the specific region over a longer period of time. Climate change refers to long-term changes. However, our changing climate is now definitely impacting our day-to-day weather, which is now changing as well. Regarding the second point made in this comment, if stopping or slowing down climate change is something that's even possible, or if it's just part of the Earth's evolution. So a couple things here. It's absolutely the case that we can slow down climate change and mitigate the climate crisis. Climate Crisis 101, this course, is designed to explain just how we can do that. As to the question of whether or not this is part of the Earth's evolution, this is definitely not a natural occurrence, but rather is principally being caused by human beings. In other words, the Earth would not be evolving in this direction if we were not doing the things that we are doing. However, you can look at this issue and approach the other way around. Yeah. So back in the middle of the 20th century, the physicist Enrico Fermi wondered why there is no convincing evidence that the Earth has ever been visited by extraterrestrial civilizations. Given that the universe is so large and likely filled with habitable planets, Fermi actually sat down and calculated that we should definitely have been contacted or visited by now. Why haven't we? Well, there's been a recent study that suggests that intelligent species may simply, as part of their natural evolution, inevitably wipe themselves out through something like nuclear holocaust or runaway climate change. This would mean that the overwhelming majority of peak Milky Way civilizations are already gone. In this sense, the climate crisis could be a natural occurrence, as it signals the zenith and corresponding collapse of human civilization on Earth. This is, of course, a horrific thought. However, I am firmly of the opinion that we can beat Fermi's odds and get through this, and perhaps one day venture out to meet other civilizations. David Wallace Wells presents, this is the next comment, statistics that put these issues in perspective on a scale to help me understand the severity of global warming and what it's done to our planet and what will happen to the future if we fail to take action. What reference to a time when the Earth is likely to become uninhabitable gives the reader an understanding of how little time there is relevant to their lifespan. So, related to the above point of when the climate crisis is going to begin, as I noted, it's obviously already started, is the complementary question of how and when it will end. As David Wallace Wells makes clear, nearly all of the consequences that scientists have laid out, which of course he's reporting on, largely happened in this century. So these consequences in the 21st century. In other words, the horrific effects of anthropogenic climate change will largely occur in a single lifetime, that of my current students, your lifetime. Consequently, just as the climate crisis was largely brought about by a single generation, and that's mine, and I'll explore this issue in some detail in the chapter on climate and generation, which is a little lecture sequence, the full brunt of the crisis will be felt by another single generation, and that's yours. Of course, it won't stop there, as it will also be felt by many subsequent generations. But the first generation to experience this, your generation, will see and feel some of the worst of it. Consequently, as this comment rightly notes, David Wallace Wells gives the reader an understanding of how little time there is to act to mitigate the climate crisis relative to their own lifespan, your lifespan. Next comment. I would say this article was more thought-provoking and interesting than most of the environmental films and readings that I have read in the past. A lot of environmental articles usually conclude by saying global warming will result in a tremendous amount of world disasters, such as sea level rise causing cities to flood, more natural disasters, or some type of economic crisis. But with Wallace Wells, he goes on to further in his article to explain by adding how dramatic environmental changes will deeply affect human lives. So my comment, this is a really important point. So when we think of the climate crisis, we often think of it in terms of the impact that it will have on the climate and the environment. And what do I mean by that? I mean floods, droughts, wildfires, so forth. Of course, this is accurate, as all this and much more is already happening. We sometimes also look at how the crisis will impact life on Earth, such as by killing off coral reefs and by bringing about the planet's sixth extinction event, which is happening now. However, as David Wallace Wells and this comment makes clear, this dramatic environmental change will deeply impact human lives. Millions, and in some cases, hundreds of millions of people will starve or be forced to migrate and will die as a result of the climate crisis. Consequently, even if someone were horrifically selfish and didn't care about the planet and its remarkable breadth of life, non-human life, mitigating the climate crisis just makes sense, as it may well reduce your own personal suffering in the future, as well as the suffering of, any of your progeny that you may have. But the fact is, we really need to take care of this, to care about the planet in this life, even as just for selfish reasons. As I've noted, nearly 1 billion people rely on coral reef ecosystems for food, especially protein. If we allow coral reefs to die, 1 billion human beings will suffer the consequences. So, next comment. Part 2 of David Wallace Wells' article on heat death did a great job of highlighting how the change in climate could result in direct casualties via heat. It brings the question of what would happen in the case of extreme heat rise. The poorest areas do not have air conditioning nor the ability to mitigate a cooler climate. How would this additional problem be addressed by nations? Nations such as Iraq and India would struggle with a large lower class population, poor infrastructure. I was also surprised to see how people in El Salvador are already experiencing the effects of climate change. So my comment, which is, how indeed do we deal with the fact that changes in climate could result in direct casualties via heat? So, give you an example. Mumbai is India's second most populated city with roughly 20 million people. Because it's in a tropical climate, the mean maximum temperature is more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit for nearly every month. So in 2009, a study calculated that the potential cooling demands in metropolitan Mumbai is about 24% of the entire United States. In other words, if Mumbai is required to convert to air conditioning to allow the city to remain habitable, it would require 1/4 of the electricity demanded by the cooling for the entire United States, and that's just for one city. If vast portions of the earth are made uninhabitable because of high temperatures, it would require, an extraordinary amount of energy to allow the people there to survive. Of course, migration would also be a possibility for some people, but not for everyone, as some neighboring countries might close their borders to migrants. I know. For some countries like the United States, this sounds unimaginable. After all, would our government be morally fine with closing our borders to people in desperate need? And even if we did, would we actually try to build an enormous wall spanning nearly 2,000 miles on our southern border in order to keep migrants out? I know, when you put it that way, it sounds almost unthinkable. Unfortunately, as you know, the idea has indeed occurred to people. Okay, who in fact thought it was a good idea. It is truly frightening to think that we could enter an era of even greater nationalism than we had today, made possible because vast migrations of people fleeing climate change. So this is the next comment. The end of the article explains what needs to be done in order to hopefully not permanently destroy the Earth. Wallace outlines the solutions as follows. Cut carbon emissions from industry and energy by half each decade. Get emissions from land use to zero. And there must be technology that can extract carbon from the atmosphere at 2 times as fast as plants can. We need to take these extreme measures right away before it's too late. This comment is perfectly to the point. When put this way, it seems simple enough. And in a way, it really is simple. We just need to cut GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, and we do what we can to extract the emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. If we can succeed at this, then we can not only stop the rise of emissions, but actually reduce them. And, by reducing them in the process, turn back the clock to a time when atmospheric CO2 levels were at a, manageable level. Although atmospheric CO2 stood at about 280 parts per million for thousands of years up into Shakespeare's time, I think it's pretty safe to say that setting a goal a little above that would also be acceptable. Say 315 parts per million, which incidentally is where atmospheric CO2 levels were when I was born in 1959. Of course, this is easy to say, but it's going to be hard to do. Not the least of which because currently we have no meaningful legislation in the U.S. to reel in GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, from industry. Nor have people, especially U.S. citizens, shown much interest in reducing their personal greenhouse gas emissions by changing their habits. And what I mean by that is like driving, flying, eating beef, buying fast fashion, and go on and on. Finally, we do not presently have the technology to practically and economically extract carbon from the atmosphere. Unfortunately, much research has gone into carbon capture and sequestration. That's called CCS, also called carbon capture and storage sometimes. A lot of research most of it is being done by fossil fuel companies so they can continue to profit from extracting fossil fuels. In essence, their position has been, if you keep letting us extract and burn fossil fuels, we'll figure out a way of pulling the resultant CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is, of course, a very convoluted course of action, especially as a far simpler solution is to stop extracting fossil fuels from the earth to begin with. However, there's no money in this approach for the fossil fuel industry. They're not pursuing this solution. Next comment. Not to be pessimistic or fatalistic, but throughout the article I felt like I was reading a manual on how to create a mass extinction. So, hypothetically, what if the human race, for some inexplicable reason, wanted to make the Earth as uninhabitable as possible, not only for our species, but for all life on the planet? I know, this sounds a little, like the Death Star from the Star Wars franchise, except rather than destroying the planet itself, such an undertaking would just kill as much life as possible, as well as render extinct as many species as possible. Could destruction on such a planetary level be achieved? If so, how? Setting aside that attempting to do this would be downright irrational, it seems to me that human beings have not only come up with 2 entirely plausible ways of bringing this about, but came close to doing the first and actually are in the process of enacting the second. The first is the idea of, this is, quote, mutually assured destruction, which was developed during the Cold War, as you may know, and which is, I think I'm quoting Wikipedia here, is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy in which a full-scale use of nuclear weapons by 2 or more opposing sides would cause the complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. So, In addition to ensuring the annihilation of both the attacker and the defender, like the United States and the former Soviet Union, this could profoundly impact all life on Earth, as detonating a few as 100 nuclear warheads could initiate something called a nuclear winter. By blasting particles high into the atmosphere, where they would blanket the Earth for some period of time, thereby significantly cooling the planet. This is in essence the same thing that happened during the fifth extinction event, when an asteroid hit the Earth, thereby sending particles high into the atmosphere and causing a similar kind of winter, cooling of the planet that, as you know, brought about the extinction of the dinosaurs. Whether or not 100 nuclear warheads could bring about a nuclear winter is something that scientists, still sometimes debate. However, it's estimated that the United States produced more than 70,000 nuclear warheads since 1945, and that other states did as well. The Soviet Union, now Russia, produced 55,000 nuclear warheads since 1949. In other words, if the United States and Russia were intent on mutually assured destruction, together they could explode 1,000 times more nuclear weapons than the amount that might trigger a nuclear winter. Consequently, it might seem that this is the closest thing that we have to a Death Star. However, there is a second option. We could, for hundreds of years, devote our global economy to digging up and burning fossil fuels. Doing so would have the opposite effect on the global climate, as it would dramatically heat rather than cool the planet. However, there's considerable evidence that this would be an effective strategy, heating rather than cooling. While the extinction event that brought to the end of the era of the dinosaurs was caused by cooling of the planet, the other four major extinction events prior to that were caused by global warming brought about through the rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Since, as David Wallace Wells notes, we are currently releasing greenhouse gases at a rate that's 10 times what it was during the Permian-Triassic event, which killed off 97% of life on our planet. This approach may, in fact, be the closest thing that we have to a Death Star. Apologies for framing the climate crisis in such a horrific way. However, as David Wallace Wells notes, if we continue to burn fossil fuels at the current rate, we risk making our once welcoming planet uninhabitable for a great deal of life on Earth, including human beings. It's a sad but real fact. Okay, thank you.